Imagine, it's early 1912 and you've had the misfortune to drop dead on the mean streets of Seattle with no identity, no money, or family nearby to claim your body. After a few days, King County Coroner Hoy would call the horse-drawn hearse to bring you to the Potter's Field, a lonely, windy point of land next to the county hospital and poor farm along the Duwamish River. You're laid to rest in a plain pine box in a long trench, likely squeezed between yesterday's and tomorrow's dead. No funeral, no eulogy, no obituary. You, along with 3,260 of your fellow deceased going back to 1879, could have rested forever on this thin point of land inside a meander of the Duwamish River. However, the Army Corps of Engineers and other civic boosters had other ideas.
Now that we've set the scene, we want to welcome you to our 2023 Pacific Northwest Historians Guild presentation of Seattle's Lost Cemetery. My name's Elka Hadala. I'm honored and excited to be collaborating with Friends of Georgetown History on this important research topic. As a filmmaker, performer, and visual anthropologist with a passion for history, public engagement and highlighting marginalized voices are two of the main goals of my work. My art manifests in everything from feature documentaries to photo essays to original songs. I've presented or exhibited everywhere from Friends of Georgetown History's Haunted History Tour to the Neptune Theater, the Social Justice Film Festival, and the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam. And I've recently acquired my master's degree in visual anthropology from HMKW Berlin. And now let me introduce you to my colleague, my partner in crime, Carrie Simpson.
Thank you. I'm Carrie Simpson. I'm a creative mixed media artist and environmental consultant based here in Seattle, and I've focused on connecting people with their local environments. I'm also the producer of the Friends of Georgetown History's annual Georgetown Haunted History Tour, which has entertained sold-out crowds for the past several years. I'm a teacher of lost knowledge with a space at Equinox Studios in Georgetown, and a catalyst and community connector to bring big ideas to fruition by assembling diverse teams and partnerships, just like this project with Elka. And the Friends of Georgetown History, or FOGI, as in Old Fogey, is a community-centered heritage and cultural arts organization that brings local history to life through engaging performances, guided tours, and presentations throughout the year. The organization also regularly shares information on social media, its webpage, and through virtual lunch and learn presentations. FOGI highlights the local and diverse ethnic history of the geographic area by giving living cultural experts a platform to share and engage with the public. Since 2004, FOGI has produced the Georgetown Haunted History Tour, an annual guided tour and theatrical event on the streets of Georgetown and historic buildings. And you can learn more at foghi.org.
Here's an overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll tell you about our 3,260 Souls mystery, how we uncovered it in Seattle's Georgetown neighborhood. And then we'll have a brief overview of the 1912 to 1917 dredging and straightening of the Duwamish River and removal of the cemetery to create profitable industrial properties. Next, we'll talk about evolution of the landscape over time through maps. And then I'll talk about who was buried in the Potter's Field. And we'll both talk about stories of marginalized people. Finally, we'll identify further research and ideas for public performance.
So you might think that a cemetery and a graveyard are the same, as they are used interchangeably in our cultural vernacular, both historically and in the present day. But in our research, we discovered that a cemetery is a burial area unaffiliated with a place of worship. Both religious and non-believers can be buried there, and these can be private or public. A graveyard is typically a burial area connected to a place of worship, usually a churchyard, and plots are reserved for people of that religion or church. And a Potter's Field is a name used from the 17th century through the 20th century as an institution based on a biblical reference to a place where potters dug for clay, and thus a place conveniently full of trenches and holes for the burial of strangers or people without the means for burial elsewhere. And then the word indigent means a poor person or someone in need of services. So here we are uncovering a mystery from over 100 years ago. As the producer of the Georgetown Haunted History Tour for the past 3 years, I'm very excited to be celebrating the tour's 20th year in 2023. Previously, as a performer on the tour, I'd heard many tales over the years of bodies being dumped in the river from an old cemetery. Stories of ashes being scattered in the river have haunted the tour for years, and people remembered hearing about a cemetery near the old King County Hospital, but the details were very few. So was any of this true? And so during the pandemic, on the verge of death from boredom, I happened to find this 1905 map from the Army Corps that you can see here that clearly shows county graveyard on it. And that started me down this rabbit hole. I began to research this project, which has definitely given me life and evolved into something of an obsession, now involving Elka, that has also brought me so much joy over the past few years. So we're uncovering the truth about where this burial place was located on today's landscape and what happened to the people who were buried there. So over the next few slides, I'm going to talk through the changes in the landscape from when the glacier last retreated 14,000 years ago through today. And maps, just to know, maps can totally lie and are written by the conqueror, but they can also point to what's been hidden or forgotten in such a demonstrative way. So on the left, you'll see an 1862 Government Land Office survey map overlaid with today's satellite map, created by Amr Sheikh. Inside the obvious double-lobed shape is what we know today as the Georgetown neighborhood of Seattle. But at the time, just after the Treaty of Point Elliott, unceded indigenous land and then known as King County. From the Find a Grave webpage, the Duwamish Cemetery, 1876 to 1912, was located on a knoll overlooking the Duwamish River at the King County Hospital and Poor Farm. The Potter's Field was located inside the upper lobe. So Amr's work led in 2014 to creating the water lines map, which you can see on the right, which distinctly shows the changes in the landscape of the Duwamish River pre-contact and colonization. Prior to European and Euro-American settlement and land claims in Seattle in 1851, there were 5,300 acres of tidal mudflats and wetlands in what we call the Duwamish Valley. Puget Sound Coast Salish people have been here since the end of the last ice age 14,000 years ago, and by the 19th century were living in hundreds of longhouses that were built from the mouth of the Duwamish up through today's Renton and Auburn. So changes in the land. In just under 35 years, from 1876 to 1912, over 3,260 bodies were buried at the Duwamish Cemetery, aka King County Poor Farm Cemetery, also known as the Potter's Field. At the end of August 1911, the county right-of-way agent was instructed to find a new location for Potter's Field and purchase the same, the old location being on the right-of-way of the Duwamish Canal. We did not find records of the county purchasing a new location for the Potter's Field. So, and some neighborhood context. On January 8th, 1904, Georgetown incorporated as a city, but would soon become annexed into the city of Seattle through a vote in 1907. As our research began, we connected with Danielle Coyle at the King County Archives, who was amazing, and connected us with some archival materials, including this 1907 King County Road Services map, which you can see on the left. Prior to the river being dredged and straightened, but you could tell that planning was already underway. The 1907 map clearly shows the original location of the Potter's Field along the river near the Poor Farm buildings. Charleston Avenue becomes today's Corson Avenue, connecting East Marginal Way north to South Michigan Street, South Bailey, and the I-5 on-ramp. By 1912, the Potter's Field is no longer shown on the map on the right, and all the Poor Farm buildings are still shown, including orchards, fences, greenhouses, and outbuildings. The dark cross-shaped building you can see on the 1912 map is the crematorium building that was specially built to cremate all 3,260 human remains, or what was left of them, in the Potter's Field. Dredging of the Duwamish River began here in 1913, and per some research from the Army Corps, the old location of the Potter's Field was where they began to stage the equipment. But let's go back briefly to 1912, specifically the last 3 months of that year. Imagine Seattle in November, cold, clammy, overcast, the smoky air from local industries blocking out the meager sun. The county had entered a contract with Mr. Noyce, who was the undertaker of the Georgetown Funeral Home and also a leader of the Oddfellows Comet Lodge right there in Georgetown. He's tasked with the gruesome task of disinterring, cremating, and columbarium storage of bodies from the Duwamish Cemetery. In November, the county hired a crematorium caretaker and assistant directly responsible to the county commissioners, who have also issued rules for the crematorium operations. And the crematorium you can see on the picture on the left. The new crematorium in Georgetown could also accept fee-based private cremations, as well as the 3,260 who needed to be quickly removed and cremated by the end of 1912. The county built a crematorium next to the old cemetery on the land that's now under the Georgetown campus of South Seattle College. And this was no ordinary industrial crematorium. As you can see, this has elaborate Gothic-style brick building with rosette windows and an adjoining chapel. The county even hired the Olmsted brothers to create a landscaping plan for the grounds, the western edge of the Poor Farm property. Mr. Noyce began the grim task to exhume and deliver 85 bodies per day to the crematory. He was paid $2.50 per body removed from the field, using skulls to keep count. In the same time frame, he and Miss Dr. Corson from the King County Hospital were also managing the sale of burial plots for the Comet Lodge Cemetery, of which they both were members. That story didn't turn out so well either for those who've researched or visited the Comet Lodge Cemetery on South Graham Street. So imagine the task ahead to cremate 3,260 bodies in just 39 days, many of which were decomposed beyond recognition. The bodily remains were each to be stored in individual cans. However, according to some accounts, they purchased metal cans that were too small. Imagine baked bean cans versus a small soup can. And what happened next was deemed beyond understanding by the state auditor in December of 1912. In a March 25, 1913 Post-Intelligencer article, "Say County Let Loose Contract," the reporter wrote that careless and unbusinesslike methods were used, including the ashes of as many as 163 bodies being raked to the floor of the county crematorium and distributed into individual receptacles purporting to bear the name of each person. Mr. Noyce claimed he was only hired to deliver every headboard to the crematory, and if these were destroyed, it was done after they left his possession. The state examiners recommended that the 3,260 receptacles containing mixed ashes of many bodies be discarded, and the ashes placed in one receptacle, and that the fiction of a name on a can be removed from the columbarium shelves. So this is likely where the neighborhood lore around the disposal of ashes into the Duwamish River originated. As of this writing, there is no evidence to explain what happened to the cremated remains of the 3,260 people in 1912. The crematorium itself was dismantled in 1941 by the National Youth Administration as a training project, with equipment and materials salvaged and stored by King County. Can you imagine what might still be in storage somewhere? So here's one final map from 1921 of Georgetown from the King County Road Services. So you can see the now straightened Duwamish River is flowing north on the upper left corner of the map crop, running parallel to East Marginal Way. The lost Potter's Field is below the industrial and rail lines shown in the bottom left corner. And the crematorium is still on the Poor Farm property, the black cross-shaped building. The brick King County Hospital is on the corner of Corson and South Michigan in the bottom right corner. And on the corner of East Marginal Way and South Corson, you can see the future gas station site of the Hat and Boots Premium Tex gas station. So we hope to make this stretch of South Corson Street into an immersive walking tour and experience for people to connect with what the neighborhood looked like in the past. So this final map overlay was made by Eric Anderson, a local archaeologist we connected with as part of our research. This shows the 1907 map overlaid on the modern streetscape. The address of the Potter's Field location is currently today 500 South Myrtle Street, just north of Seattle Iron and Metals and under today's Seattle Boiler Works.
So just how did one end up buried in the Potter's Field? This is the question I was asking myself, and two key locations emerged as we delved into our research: the King County Poor Farm and the King County Hospital and TB Sanatorium. You can see on the left there we have Asael Curtis photo of the original hospital and almshouse. And on the right, we have a newer version of the King County Almshouse and Hospital exterior. Of course, I say newer, and built in 1895. And I like the one on the left there because you can just see how different, how much Georgetown has changed over the years. In fact, there's cows in that image, and there's definitely less cows in Georgetown today. Based on an 1854 law that counties had to take care of their poor, King County assumed ownership of 160 acres of farmland from John Thompson, who had died without heirs in 1869. But what was it like to actually live and die there? An article in the Seattle Daily Times from 1907 by Walter Defenbaugh, although solidly situated in the biases of the time, it provides us an illuminating glimpse. Some there were old, some blind, most feeble, some were young men temporarily disabled. They had, in Walter's words, saloons and mocking real estate signs on one side and the wet, winding river and dreary pines on the other side. About 30 people were on the 90-acre farm. They would have to work, weed, prepare vegetables, and 140 in the hospital, give or take. Those who could work there worked too, in the kitchen, scrubbing the floors, sweeping, watering the lawn, almost all men. In a striking quote highlighting women of a certain age's long struggle for agency and visibility, Mr. Defenbaugh says, "There is no good place in this country to send an unfortunate old lady whose only affliction is her years and her inability to earn a living." Another wonderful image from Mr. Curtis, and this is courtesy of the Washington State Historical Society, so we want to thank them for their help on our research. And this is an image of the sanatorium in 1909 on the banks of the river, and on the right-hand side we have a cover for the newspaper article that I've been referencing. By 1900, Seattle had one of the highest incidences of TB per capita in the United States. And patients with communicable diseases, including influenza, were sent there. The Georgetown Sanatorium housed patients on land surrounding the King County Hospital from 1903 to 1911, where the Georgetown South Seattle College campus is today. And yes, I did say on land surrounding, not in the actual hospital, because due to the medical understanding and practices of the time, patients were housed in open-air tents on platforms backed up over the Duwamish River and on top of the drain pipes. From the Seattle Daily Times, "Poor fellas who lie all day and all night in the big tents out along the riverbank with curtains pulled up high on every clear day and not a passing human being to break the monotony, nothing but the petty little lapping of the foolish river to make one moment different from the next, and no one to care whether the moment 3 heartbeats away will be their last." And there were 16 men there at the time of the article, not just Americans either, but British, Scandinavian, Filipino, Japanese. Some couldn't even speak English. And most people there died coughing in the cold, foggy, foul conditions by the river. Then, unless a family member came to claim the body, they were buried in the Potter's Field, just along the shoreline to the right of this photo. Now, the Seattle Star newspaper did an investigative report, which led to a grand jury investigation that, not surprisingly, found the conditions inhumane and the management of the hospital itself horrific. When we dove into the King County archives, We were able to look at reports and investigations by the state auditors into just how terrible the King County Hospital was, including testimony from former workers and patients. It really was heartbreaking and eye-opening. One story talks about a man that was being carried by a worker, and the man discovered his hand was still warm and told that to the nurse, who said, "He's surely dead now, come on," and basically hurried him along. Someone else who was a patient who talked to the Seattle Star for their investigative report mentioned that they were given only bread and water after talking to them because they told him next time he'll learn to keep his mouth shut. So these are just some of the horrific stories that came out of there. The silver lining in all of this was that it eventually led to reforms like the Anti-Tuberculosis League, which was formed in the very year of this picture, 1909. And this led King County Public Health to create a new sanatorium in Fircrest, a city north of Seattle, or actually an area north of Seattle in the city of Shoreline. Now we've begun to realize just how far this story goes. We visited the King County Archives, as I mentioned, and not only did we get to look at the state auditor's report, but we also got to look at the actual burial registry from 1912, and the state auditor's scathing report was from 1913. In the burial registry, there were 855 that had names and dates on the headboards, 493 had only numbers on the headboards, and 1,912 had no mark with numbers or names and no headboards. So those people are essentially completely lost to history. And now we have two amazing volunteers who joined the team, Rose and Patty. Thank you very much. They began helping us, and we start looking through all these newspaper articles, and we find an avalanche of information. Those buried in the Potter's Field run the gamut from infants to Civil War veterans to one of the first Sikhs in Seattle to condemned outlaws not fit for hallowed ground. And these names and numbers begin to give us insight beyond the headlines and history books. Where are the women? This is the question I began asking myself, and this is something of particular interest to us as we begin delving into the names that we found in the burial registry or in the newspaper searches for the Potter's Field in Seattle. And this turned out to be quite a challenge for a number of reasons. First, we found out the community would often help to raise money to bury women and children somewhere else if they could. There was a stigma with being buried there. And remember, this was a time when women were still referenced by their husbands' names, too. They had a lot less potential records for investigating more about who they were. Nevertheless, we were able to find key news stories on several women with less than stellar fates. The picture up there is sadly not Mary Lake, but it is a studio portrait from around 1900, and I like to imagine that it could have been her. It gives you a visual reference for style and dress around the time period. Now, Mary Lake was embroiled in what I like to call the Melrose Place thriller of the early 1900s, found with a Mr. Thomas at a place called the Fredonia House by her husband. He shot them both and then turned the gun on himself. It was thought that she might survive, but she died of her injuries several days later. A telling piece from the article is the murderer's mom sending a telegram all the way from Nova Scotia that she was unable to bear the funeral expenses. And all three were buried in the Potter's Field, linked together by eternity. Continuing with the visibility of female lives from the Potter's Field, we really only have what is listed in the newspaper to go on. And it is important to understand that this is framed from a specific viewpoint, and it may not accurately reflect the women or their actual lived experience. But it does give us a glimpse. In the long-told tale of the jilted lover, we have Mrs. Leah Lynn's story bringing a new twist. He was a fisherman. He came back from sea upon hearing she had unexpectedly passed. He seized the body. I like how they add he appeared heartbroken, so he must have met with foul play because this dude skipped town so he didn't have to pay for his dead wife's burial, and she ended up in a pauper's grave. And they still find it germane to mention that she was a pretty woman of 28 years. On the other side of things, Mary Dugan is an example of an unmarried woman whose story is shrouded in mystery. So she came up from Portland with several friends using the name Mrs. Mary Dugan. And it's questionable whether she was actually married. She found work as a domestic and went into convulsions one day, was taken to the Wayside Mission Hospital, and subsequently died. There was talk of a criminal investigation because of the suddenness and specifics of her death, but I'm not sure if it ever actually came to pass. Interestingly, they mentioned in the article that she was found to be in a delicate condition, which could indicate an even more tragic tale. With no known relatives coming forward, she was destined for the Potter's Field, but we haven't found the name that she was using on the findagrave.com listing of transcribed names. So it seems she is still destined for mystery. We're not sure if she ever actually ended up there. So first, I want to give a trigger warning that this slide does contain racist material in the newspaper article. James Carter is another interesting story that we hope to be able to find out more about. He was definitely buried in the Potter's Field, and there is a March 17, 1902 newspaper article that you can see on the slide. I'm not going to quote it because it is very biased and racist, but it does help us find more possible clues about his life. He was a runaway slave who came from the South to Seattle. He struggled with alcoholism. He was on the poor farm for at least part of his life, and he had been arrested. Now, we really want to find out more insight into life from his perspective, so we reached out to Ethel Marie at the Black Heritage Society. The census document is from the 12th one in 1900. There is a James Carter listed on there as a head of household who was from Virginia, but I haven't been able to verify if it is the same man. There's also a prison record from around that same time for a James Carter. Now, Ethel Marie let us know that there is a well-known local Black family by the name of Carter from Virginia, and we're looking at talking to a scholar that she recommended and connecting more with the Black Heritage Society, including visiting their archives to see if we can make additional connections and keep following these threads.
So one of the great mysteries of those buried in the Potter's Field is Ingo Singh. Ingo is listed as 40 years old on his death notice, which you can see there in the upper right corner. And guess who else was born around the same time? Mahatma Gandhi was born on the 2nd of October, 1869, and the future leader of India. So just for some context, so we don't know exactly where Ingo was born, but we know he was of the Sikh religion, and we can guess at how and why he ended up in this area. From Sikh.net, the first well-known record of Sikhs visiting the Pacific Northwest was in 1897. They were soldiers for the British Empire who traveled throughout Canada on their way back home after the Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Sikhs saw potential in this place, and not long after, mostly male laborers made their way here to the Pacific Northwest. In fact, one newspaper mentions Leena and Pola Singh being the first two to arrive from Canada by walking over the border at Blaine, Washington in early January 1906. They were detained for 2 months and eventually deported after being found to be illegally in the country. But most were British citizens, usually many were former soldiers. The article is very othering in the way that it mentions all the peculiarities of their dress, manner, and refusal to eat anything but rice they have cooked themselves. And from a Peter Manceau article on Slate.com, A Forgotten History of Anti-Sikh Violence in the Early 20th Century Pacific Northwest, the press often called them Hindus, but they were often Sikhs from northern India region of Punjab. Sikhs soon became valuable employees in the logging industry, especially in Bellingham. From the article, we cannot get white men who will remain steadily at work, one lumber mill owner told the Bellingham Herald. A large number are transient and work only for whiskey money, leaving the company in the lurch just at the time that their services are most desired. The Sikh religion prohibited consuming alcohol. Mr. Manceau's article led to the resources at the South Asian American Digital Archives, which has several newspaper articles from the Bellingham Herald and Puget Sound American. One in particular, from September 16, 1906, is titled, Have we a dusky peril, Hindu hordes invading the state, with echoes of current racist beliefs and discussions about immigrants from Mexico and Central America and building a border wall? This is a reminder that there is always fear, a fear of the difference, fear of jobs being taken away. Mistreatment, hate, and violence often follow, as we can see from the 1907 anti-Hindu riots in Bellingham. We don't know if Ingo had been in Bellingham or perhaps was on his way there when he became sick or injured. One discovery we have made is his death certificate, confirming that he was treated and died at the Wayside Mission Hospital. Mary Dugan also went there and died, as Elka mentioned. On April 1st, 1899, a group of philanthropic citizens, including Dr. Alexander De Soto, formed the Seattle Benevolent Society, which purchased the decommissioned sidewheel steamboat Idaho and refitted it as an emergency hospital for Seattle's indigent population. The Idaho was placed on pilings alongside the Pacific Coast Steamship Company's Pier C at the foot of Jackson Street and was reopened as the Wayside Mission Hospital. In 1907, due to structural failures, the Idaho was abandoned and hospital activities moved ashore near 2nd Ave and Republican Street under today's Seattle Center fountain. It's possible that he never actually made it past the waterfront, but we can only imagine a little bit more about Ingo's final days with this information. Today, near the foot of South Washington Street, a historical marker is placed in 1960 on National Maritime Day at the location of the Idaho's final resting place. The marker reads, "Beneath your feet lies the wreckage of the pioneer sidewheel steamer Idaho, which served from 1900 till 1909 as Dr. Alexander De Soto's famous Wayside Mission Hospital. Here, Dr. De Soto ministered to the needs of seafarers and the destitute, donating his time and funds to their care." So another character, perhaps worthy of a Pacific Northwest noir film, is Thomas Hamilton Blank. Born in New York and known as the Jesse James of the Pacific Northwest for killing at least 5 people from California to British Columbia, Canada, and dying in a gunfight before his 25th birthday. On October 1894, he had been convicted in King County Superior Court of the murder of a bartender, Charles H. Bridwell, and sentenced to hang on December 7th, but the case was appealed and his execution was stayed. He spent his nights in jail secretly crafting a replica Smith & Wesson double-action revolver, his favorite weapon. Using a knife made from a steel shank in his shoe, Blank whittled and shaped the pieces, then smoothed them with pieces of broken glass. The model was held together with matchsticks, thread, chewing gum, and soap, and blackened with a mixture of grease and soot. To add authenticity, Blank fabricated realistic bullets from pieces of tobacco-packed tinfoil and inserted them into the face of the cylinder. Having painstakingly worked on the project for 3 months, he was now ready to implement his escape plan. At 7:30 p.m. on Sunday, March 17, 1895, night jailer Jeremiah Jerry Yerbury, age 39, left the jailer's office and approached the pass-through in the steel tank to deliver a nightly dose of medicine to a prisoner. Blank pulled the imitation gun from under his shirt, stuck it through the bars, and told the jailer to surrender or be immediately killed. He tied up the jailer, stole his gun, and escaped, and for the next 5 days played cat and mouse with police from Seattle to Kent and Auburn. He was ultimately killed in a shootout with police. The coroner also determined he was slowly dying of pneumonia from being on the run in the cold Pacific Northwest elements. And according to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, at least 18,000 people filed past his coffin at the Butterworth Funeral Parlor on Friday alone. The street in front of the undertaking rooms were crowded all day from early morning until evening, and so great was the pressure on the doors, despite the efforts of 5 policemen, that the public was admitted long before the intended time. Almost as many women as men took advantage of the opportunity to get a look at the greatest of Northwest criminals, and one woman even kissed him. Many who came brought flowers, and which were placed in and around his coffin. Blank was unceremoniously buried in the Potter's Field at the end of March 1895. 1 month later, allegedly, Blank's replica revolver was put on display in Port Townsend, where he had once been arrested to raise money for a church charity. 130 people paid a nickel to view the artifact, netting the charity $6.50. We did try to track down this artifact with the Jefferson County Historical Society, but they had no record of this artifact entering their archives, unfortunately. Have you heard about this classic Georgetown true crime story of A.E. Levan? In June 1903, a headless corpse was pulled from the Duwamish River next to the Meadows racetrack, where the south side of the King County Airport is now. The body was decomposed and without identification, readily accessible by authorities, and so the body was quickly buried in the Potter's Field in Georgetown. The newspaper says a fortnight went by and a Seattle merchant named Kessler, who had some suspicion of who the corpse could have been, asked to be present when the body was exhumed to confirm the identity. Kessler looked at the clothing on the body and, knowing it was a suit he had sold to A.E. Levan of Sunnysdale, confirmed that the headless corpse was Mr. Levan. Kessler checked the suit pockets and found a key that fit the lock on Levan's house. And now that the name could be put on a gravestone, Levan's corpse was taken by his family and reburied in the old Bicker Shalom Cemetery in North Seattle, where you can visit him today. Friends and family of Levan were convinced that he was murdered by his racetrack gambling enemies and thrown into the Duwamish River, but no one was ever charged with the crime. The Seattle coroner, Mr. Hoy, was positive Levan was most foully murdered. So one tiny artifact that we may have to link directly with the Potter's Field is this mystery grave marker provided by John Dove. So when the new King County Hospital building was built in 1895, early burials around the old hospital may have been moved and markers displaced. The small grave marker was found in the yard of John Dove near South Orchid Street and South Padilla. And looking at the Potter's Field exhumation records, this could have been from Fred Finney, who died September 4th, 1910, or perhaps Fred Foy, who died April 28th, 1909.
Well, now we've determined where the cemetery was and the diversity and complexity of who was buried there, and the reality that there may be no answer to where the ashes ended up. It may well be true that they were swept into the river like oral history tells us. We know the whole operation was catastrophically mishandled. What does this all mean? It's not only hyperlocal, but a strikingly universal story of forced industrialization and marginalization in areas where new immigrants and minority groups often lived and continue to live. Take a look at New York's Hart Island and the Potter's Field there, and you'll see an image from the New York City Council website up there. And this started in 1869 as a public cemetery for the poor and indigent. It now has over 1 million individuals buried there, and they are finally letting friends or family access part of the area. I believe the docks, actually. And the Hart Island Project is memorializing individuals buried there who were lost to anonymity through their digital mapping, which if you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. The silver lining for our story is that the auditor's report did lead to reforms. Now the medical examiner for King County has a special indigent burial program in which they have a lovely public ceremony every couple of years, and they keep the remains separated in case a family member comes to claim them. The question then becomes, how do we memorialize those lost? How do we help the public learn about this history? And how do we connect it to where we are today? So a big question for us is, how do we share with people what we now know? And aside from my habit of telling strangers on the bus, if they'll sit long enough to listen, stories from the past, we do want to invite connections to the community, partners for events, memorials, projects. We also want to do the opposite of what some in the history profession have been accused of, and instead of leaning into our Luddite tendencies, embrace technology. You see, we have one major problem to overcome with this project. The history has been smoothed over, changed, and built on top of in our locations. And it's a good thing Carrie and I both love to tell stories. So we're using audio for our first podcast episode, and we're planning an immersive walking tour of the actual spaces. And we're going to use eventual mobile accessible AR, augmented reality content there. Because our big problem is that there's nothing to see in the spaces now. We need to bring it to life. There are still people who believe history happened a long time ago and it doesn't affect them. And it's not just Gen Z. What's important to help them understand is that there are 1,000 threads connecting us all. And after all, how can we possibly plan for the future if we don't understand our past? And finally, we have this little image I put together, and this is down by 500 South Myrtle Street, which is where the Seattle Boiler Works is and where the Potter's Field was previously. And I have the Jacob Reese image in there inset to give you an idea, my very basic idea of what the AR technology would show you as you walked through these spaces. So here are our citations for our research, and in addition, we would like to thank our colleagues from Friends of Georgetown History, SPL, of course, King County Archives, Seattle Municipal Archives, MOHI, Washington State Archives, Washington State Historical Society, Wing Luke, Black Heritage Society, the King County Medical Examiner, and Rose and Patty, our wonderful volunteers.
We just want to say thank you very much to the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild for inviting us to be part of this year's conference. Our information is here of how to get in touch with us. You can also look at the Friends of Georgetown History's webpage at foghi.org. The QR code on your screen links to our donation page and our new Ghost Club, which is a way to support the Friends of Georgetown History and our events and other ways that we engage with the public. And Elka and I will be producing a 4-part podcast that will be coming out in 2024. So stay tuned. There's a lot more history here to share, and we really thank the Pacific Northwest Historians Guild for inviting us and
for culture for supporting us too.
For supporting us on this project. Thank you so much.
Thank you.